The Hawaiian sugar plantation era spanned nearly a century, a pivotal, complicated chapter of history that remapped the soul of the islands we call home. It was a time of immense economic change, fueled by the sweat of hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers. Thrown into an unfamiliar landscape, defined by grueling labor and geographic isolation, these workers were more than just a labor force. In the shadow of the mills, within the confines of segregated yet proximate living camps, a different kind of harvest was taking place. This was a melting pot, a place where diverse beliefs met, blended, and were ultimately reborn into something uniquely local. Growing up in Hawaii, everyone is taught supernatural lessons. Don't take pork over the pali. Don't stand in the path of the night marchers. These are the rules of the Aina, respected and feared for generations. But what about the urban legends? The stories of a faceless woman in a public restroom, or the moss-covered green lady of Wahiawa searching for her lost child. Sightings of a woman in white at the edge of the road, or gargoyle-like creatures stalking neighborhoods in the middle of the night. These aren't just whispers anymore. They've become a part of modern mythology. If you take the thousands of workers, men and women who crossed oceans carrying dreams of a better life and future, and you throw them in the isolation and the backbreaking labor of the plantation camps, what happens to their nightmares?
People have the ability to adapt. They have the ability to resist. They have the ability to change the religions. So what we see in official doctrine books and how people actually practice religions are two very different things. Therefore, it's in this gray area that these ghost stories can start arising. So you want to think of these ghost stories really as an expression of how people are adapting to a new culture, adapting to a different power structure. So that's why it's so fascinating.
This wasn't a process of simply losing one's culture. It was a conscious negotiation of what to keep and what to let in, especially for the native Hawaiians, who saw their spiritual landscape be taken over for profit.
The expectation from a present view is to look back and expect, things were all confused and people were not sure. But when we look at it, people knew who they were. Like, they understood that they had all these elements of influence and stuff coming in, and were really, really specific in a lot of ways of what they considered things that they were going to incorporate. At that moment, in a lived experience, people seemed to have a pretty good sense of who they were, and what elements from other cultures and other societies they were willing to and interested in engaging with.
These nightmares didn't just disappear. They blended. They became a way to make sense of a landscape that was being violently reshaped by industry. In the late 19th century, the Aina was carved into a grid of productivity. But the division wasn't just in the soil. It was in the social fabric of the people who worked it.
The plantation laborers were put into ethnic camps. But number one, it's, better for stability if you live among people who speak your same language or people who share your same customs. So you had these ethnic camps. And do remember, there was much diversity within Japanese, within Korean, within Okinawan immigration. So much diversity. So yes, you'd have the planters put people in different ethnic camps and actually encourage this kind of ethnic solidarity. But there was also a second reason. They were kept in separate camps so that the different ethnic groups would not organize and make strikes. Because that is the planters' worst fear of labor shortages. So you keep the Japanese to Japanese, the Koreans with the Koreans, the Filipinos with Filipinos, Okinawans with Okinawans. You reduce the chance of strikes. And that's called the divide and conquer strategy.
Even in 1920, they're able to keep the Japanese and the Filipinos from striking together. Even though they both strike at the same time, they're like, we're going to make sure that we keep them separate enough. And it worked, that the Japanese strike under their union, the Filipinos strike under their union, and the distrust between the two breaks it. So it's probably the next generation where you start to see that any sort of real strong solidarity building and cultural sharing and cultural blending happening as well.
For the workers, stories were a way to hold on to a home that was thousands of miles away. But in the islands, words carry weight. To speak of a spirit is to acknowledge its presence.
They would tell their stories. That they would tell the stories of where they were from, and by doing that, they would invite them to come down here into the fields to work to walk amongst them and stuff like that. I mean, the saying is, if you talk about them, they come, right? And so, yeah, my Auntie Mariah would say it was always just boring in the fields, and even reading some of Glenn Grant's stories and stuff, there was always like the Obon and festivals where they would get together and tell ghost stories for chicken skin and all of that kind of stuff. And that in itself, that action, I believe, invited them here.
So one aspect of folklore is it always becomes, as it were, localized. And with that in mind, I think spirits would certainly merge with local belief systems. They're always mutable and always able to mold themselves to a new environment.
As the 20th century turned, the focus of the plantation shifted from the laborers to their children. A new kind of architecture was built, the schoolhouse.
With the second generation of people born on the camps, there was now a fear that Hawaii, well, I say Japanese because they were the largest group, Hawaii was going to become part of the Empire of Japan. That if everyone only spoke Japanese, so because Japanese made up 40% of the population. And so by the 1910s, 20s or so, there was a huge push to Americanize the children of the Japanese camp workers, a huge push to Americanize the children of the Okinawan, Korean plantation workers. Filipinos were considered actually part of the U.S. since it was a U.S. colony. So there's a huge push actually in the public schools to, what we call plantation schools were developed. These were schools like Waipahu High School, where the children of plantation workers would go there and learn English, become all Americanized, and learn the value of manual work, and then go back to the plantations. So it actually started changing really with the second generation.
The intent was assimilation and the creation of a compliant labor force. But once the children were outside the gaze of the teachers and the lunas, something else happened. The gray area expanded.
Post 1900, you have definitely the ocean is one. There's a lot, just because everybody's broke and it's free. And this is one thing Hawaii's always been like, you can't block access to the water. And another one was by the 1930s, sports, all apart from 1900 on as a baseball field. But that's the spot for competition. Football, like high school football, the schools become a big one after 1900 because you have more and more children who are born into citizenship. And the public school system in Hawaii was always good about making sure everybody went. Not always good about making sure everyone got a good education. They were kind of purposeful with like the English standard schools. They're like, you guys don't get a full education. The English standard school guys get the full education. And so the spaces, a lot of them, yeah, they were those kind of spaces, like the beach, the football field, dances, and then parties. So those kind of spaces, they become places to kind of develop this local culture.
You want to start thinking it's the second generation that you start seeing a lot of intermingling. This idea of a local identity. That's really second generation. When, they're using English as their common language, they're in the schools, public schools together. That's when they start having contact with each other. And that's when you start seeing really a Pan-Asian. We say Pan-Asian academically, but a better word in Hawaii is local. Mixing in these traditions with also Native Hawaiian traditions and with also American traditions. That's what these Hawaii ghost stories are. They're really a mixture of all of these stories. Therefore, the better word to say it is local.
In the surf and the schoolyard, the children of immigrants stopped being Japanese or Chinese or Filipino in the eyes of their peers. They became something entirely new. Local. They shared lunches, they shared slang, and most importantly, they shared ghosts.
My name is Kelly Pagan Goto. I am a proud Puerto Rican, raised here in the islands, primarily on the leeward coast between both Eva Beach and Waipahu. I have strong plantation roots. My ancestors from Puerto Rico arrived about in the 1900s for a better life. There was a very tragic hurricane that took place in Puerto Rico. And by coming here, they wanted to live the ultimate dream. And with that, they had opportunity to work on the sugar plantations. First, it was Waipahu, where my grandfather started from the 4th grade, planting seeds, to eventually, as his career expanded, becoming a haul cane truck driver at the Waipahu sugar mill. Then his expertise was needed at the Eva sugar mill, where he moved his family in 1975. The sugar plantation put food on the table. My great-grandfather had his sons work from a young age to help and contribute. Education was limited. That was life. That's what my grandpa knew. That was his first true love, the sugar plantation here in Hawaii. All 4 of my grandparents spoke Spanish at home. They were Spanish as a first language. But when they went to school here locally, it was taboo, and they'd get punished if they spoke Spanish in school. So they were forced to speak English. So although my grandparents spoke Spanish, it was adult talk. My parents don't speak Spanish, and neither do my sister and I. We wish we learned, but because I think of the fear that was instilled in them that it's not allowed here and it was forced, it was definitely plantation pidgin. My grandpa, because I think Spanish was his first language, he spoke fast. And speaking Spanish, they're known to speak fast tongue. So it was definitely plantation pidgin. And being with different cultures on the plantation, he adapted. So I could see my grandpa rapping with Filipinos, with Japanese, with Portuguese, but there was no discrimination. They all found a way to equally communicate the same and get their point across. My grandfather stood at about 5'3", but very stocky, and these trucks looked like huge, ginormous elephants next to him. He looked like a little pea by these big trucks that he would just almost do a kachi Puerto Rican dance to by maneuvering and just making his way in sites now that we know of. For example, Kunia Walmart didn't exist. That was open fields. That was his playground. So that was his expertise. In the Waipahu camp, my grandpa and his family resided in the Japanese camp. Versus Eva, that was Teni Village at first. Then my grandpa had opportunity to buy a home, still in the plantation, but now I think in 1987 moved to Fernandez Village, where the home is still till today. Filipinos aplenty. They always are more friendly and wanting to feed us. As a little girl, I would see cockfights like nothing, like second nature. Cooking meat right there, which is makeshift wrought iron to keep everybody away. Like the tin roof material they would make, and it was nothing. I would be on my bike and everybody's around and never thought that it was weird. The dinner table was the gathering place. He always would start with asking my uncles, his sons, how was your day? How was work today? And that would start the storytelling. This is how my day went. This was my real life experience today. And it always would lead to my uncles chiming in, Daddy, remember back in the day, this story, tell us the story again. And for him, it wasn't that he was trying to provide entertainment. It was real. These stories really did happen. But like me, maybe I get that from him, very expressive and passionate about those life experiences. So he would tell them over and over again. And that's how myself, my cousins got to hear these stories, the history that my grandpa experienced on the plantation, and just things that remained in our family until today. His stories were not more for entertainment, so I would say more of a warning, because that story in particular, he was in the middle of nowhere. They built this city, and no truck, anybody in sight, no cell phone, darkness, just the light of him and his hulking truck. He said it started off what he thought was someone knocking on his truck. But if anyone approached, you would see lights. They wouldn't pull that kind of prank because it was odd hours. It was a 24-hour a day, 7-day-a-week operation. And again, this is in the 70s perhaps. He heard a knock, but didn't think anything of it. And they knew nobody would get out and look because nobody would do such a thing. Then it was a loud, what sounded like a boulder that hit his truck. And when he was able to see and inspect around, there was no damage to the truck. And he is awake. He was waiting for his relief to come. And so after his shift ended, they were all talking and sharing stories. And he's like, hey, and I'm going to try and mimic my grandfather as best as I can. Hey, you know, last night, I was working my shift. I was up in my area. And somebody would play a trick on me. And they said, no, nobody. Because first I heard knocking. Then one big sound like one boulder out of nowhere. And I by myself. But no damage to my truck. Explain this to me. How this happened? I know I wasn't dreaming or sleeping. And they said, Moncho, which was my grandpa's nickname. You're in the path of night marchers. You're not supposed to be there. That's a warning. That was the end of that one.
Did you know about them before?
I think that was his first time. And if he wasn't vocal about it, he could have potentially ended up in the same spot, and maybe something else worse may have happened. We don't know.
And then his coworkers that he was telling this story to, do you happen to know what their nationality was? Were they Hawaiian, or were they, like, had they been there for a while?
Primarily Filipino. So one story in particular, my auntie went out the back door to take her dog out at night. It's pitch dark. And she noticed something on the neighbor's roof looking at her. So she goes in the house and she calls my grandma. And she goes, Mommy, there's something on the roof outside, on the neighbor's roof. And she's like, what? No look. She goes, no, we have to look. I don't know what it is. They described it as a crouched down, maybe gargoyle, or was it an aswang? Filipino presence is still heavily there. We're surrounded. We have Filipino neighbors to the left and right. And it just stared at them. And came back in, and my grandma prayed and said, no look. That was always the train of thought. Turn the other cheek, because if you look, maybe you entertain it and give it life. And we'll open the door to be like, I accept this reality. Pray it away. Pray away the fears. That love for family, simple, humble upbringing. The true value of sacrifice and hard work. Because I feel like people have lost that ethic. And it's not something that can be taught. it's a spirit that's passed down, I will forever call the plantation home. I've moved out with my husband to Mililani. That's my new life, but it's always, I gotta go to the house. And they just know. The congestion of it, the fact that you sneeze, you cough, you fart, your neighbor hears you. People know people. And we've adapted to Eva the fact that I mentioned early on, people don't really leave Eva. And that's okay too. There's Zippies now, there's 7-Eleven, you can walk. The traffic, don't like. But just that togetherness and the simple humbleness of that life is what needs to be told.
As the physical landmarks of the plantation era disappear, replaced by the homogenized architecture of the mainland, the very foundation of local identity begins to fracture.
We're becoming more like the US continent than we want to admit. I don't hear people speak Pidgin anymore. Here's what gets me angry. There's nothing against Chick-fil-A. Please, don't get me wrong. But they get excited over Chick-fil-A and they line up in a car about it. They get excited over these chains from the continent coming in. And yet, what about the local stores? They should be going to the local stores to eat. Every time a local store closes down, it is replaced by a national fast food chain. We lose something. We lose a lot.
These mo'olelo will no longer be around if the places that they're anchored to disappear. People need a place to anchor the stories. That is why it is important for everyone to understand that development comes at a cost.
I think only when you lose something, you start realizing how important it was. So I want to thank you for, doing this project on ghosts. It sounds like something very trivial, and yet it's not. You are part of the young generation trying to rediscover and keep this heritage alive.
The spirits of the cane fields aren't just shadows of the past. They're reminders of a memory that refuses to be erased. By telling these stories, we aren't just looking backward. We are defining who we are before the last traces of the local are paved over.